Welcome, restless souls, to Carmen's Crypt. I'm Carmen Carrion, keeper of forgotten tales and curator of nightmares. You've wandered into my domain, where each week I unearth a fresh horror from the depths of human imagination. In these darkened halls, stories wait like hungry shadows. Each tale we've collected whispers of terrors both ancient and new. From crumbling mansions where something skitters behind the walls, to that strange text message you received at 3 a.m. from a number that shouldn't exist. So gather close. The candles are lit, the shadows grow long, and the witching hour is upon us. Are you prepared to face what lurks in the darkest recesses of Carmen's Crypt? Lock your doors, still your nerves, and remember, here, every fear comes to life. This is Carmen's Crypt. Your sanctuary of scares awaits. The Haitian explorer groaned against the crushing pressure as it descended through the midnight zone, its titanium hulls the only barrier between Dr. Thessaly Campos' research team and the most hostile environment on Earth. At 35,000 feet below the surface, they were deeper than anyone had ever gone, deeper than Mount Everest was tall, in a realm where the pressure could crush a human body in milliseconds. Thessaly pressed her palm against the cold metal wall of the submersible, feeling the subtle vibrations that indicated the hull was under stress, but holding. At 34, she had spent the last decade studying extremophiles, organisms that thrived in conditions that would kill most life forms. Her obsession with life's limits had cost her a marriage and most of her friendships, but it had also earned her recognition as one of the world's leading experts on deep-sea biology. "Sonar's picking up the trench floor," announced Caspian Webb, the submersible's pilot, his weathered hands steady on the controls, despite the magnitude of their descent. At 52, he had piloted more deep-sea expeditions than anyone alive, but even he seemed awed by their current depth. Christ almighty, it's like looking into the Earth's mouth. Caspian had survived 3 submarine disasters in his Navy days, including one that left him trapped at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean for 18 hours. The experience had given him both an intimate knowledge of humanity's fragility beneath the waves and an almost supernatural ability to read the ocean's moods. If he was nervous, they all should be. Through the reinforced viewing ports, the team stared into an abyss that seemed to swallow their powerful LED arrays whole. Dr. Thessaly checked her instruments, heart racing with scientific excitement. The Mariana Trench had been thoroughly explored, but this newly discovered fissure in the Puerto Rico Trench promised secrets that had remained buried since the planet's formation. "Pressure readings are off the charts," reported Dr. Lysander Kovac, the marine biologist whose grant funding had made this expedition possible. "Whatever's down here has been undisturbed for millions of years." Lysander had grown up in poverty in rural Croatia. His fascination with the sea, born from hours spent staring at the Adriatic from his grandmother's cliffside cottage. He had clawed his way through academia with a combination of brilliant insight and ruthless determination, eventually establishing himself as one of the foremost experts on deep-sea ecosystems. His theories about undiscovered life in the deepest trenches had been dismissed by his peers for years, until sonar mapping revealed formations in this newly discovered abyss that couldn't be explained by any known geological process. Thessaly's colleague, Dr. Octavia Rodriguez, pressed her face to the viewing port. "Look at these formations. They're too regular to be natural." Octavia had joined the expedition despite her phobia of enclosed spaces, a fear that stemmed from being trapped in a collapsed mine shaft as a child. Her expertise in xenoarchaeology, the theoretical study of non-human intelligence and artifacts, had made her invaluable to the mission. At 28, she was the youngest member of the team, but her work deciphering patterns in seemingly random natural formations had earned her tenure at MIT. As their light swept across the seafloor, strange structures emerged from the gloom, towering spires of what appeared to be coral, but arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate construction. The formations pulsed with a faint bioluminescence, creating an otherworldly cityscape in the crushing depths. "Take us closer," Thessaly ordered, her scientific curiosity overriding the fear that whispered warnings in the back of her mind. The submersible descended toward the structures, its mechanical arms extending to collect samples. As they drew nearer, the details became more disturbing. The coral formations were riddled with cavities, not random holes, but chambers that looked almost residential. "Are those dwellings?" Octavia whispered, her archaeological training recognizing patterns that the others missed. "The symmetry is too perfect. These are constructed spaces." "Constructed by what?" Lysander muttered, adjusting the external cameras for better resolution. "Nothing we know of could survive at this depth, let alone build cities." Before anyone could answer, movement caught their attention. Something pale and elongated darted between the structures, too quick to focus on, but unmistakably alive. "Did you see that?" Caspian's voice was tight with tension, his pilot's instincts screaming that they were being watched. More movement. Dozens of shapes emerged from the structures, their forms barely visible in the submersible's lights. They moved with purpose, converging on the intrusion from above with what looked disturbingly like military precision. "My God," Lysander breathed, fumbling with the external cameras. They're humanoid." The creatures that surrounded their vessel defied every principle of deep-sea evolution. Standing 8 feet tall, their bodies were elongated and pale, adapted for the crushing depths, but retaining a horrifyingly familiar bipedal structure. Their limbs were too long, ending in webbed appendages that could have been hands or feet. Most disturbing were their faces, featuring large black eyes, adapted for the eternal darkness, and mouths that split their heads nearly in half, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth designed for tearing flesh. "They're intelligent," Thessaly whispered, watching as the creatures formed organized groups around the submersible. "Look at their coordination. This isn't random animal behavior." "The formations," Octavia said, her voice barely audible. "They didn't just build those structures. They've been living in them for how long?" One of the creatures approached the viewing port, its massive black eyes meeting Thessaly's gaze. The intelligence behind those eyes was ancient and cold, filled with a malevolence that had festered in the depths for eons. When it opened its mouth, a sound penetrated the hull, not heard, but felt. A vibration that resonated in their bones and made their teeth ache. The creature's mouth moved in what might have been speech, but the sounds were unlike anything in human language. Clicks and whistles, and something that sounded almost like screaming. Other creatures joined the first, their vocalizations creating a chorus that made the hull ring like a struck bell. "It's trying to communicate," Octavia said, though her voice shook with terror. "But the language, it's not just vocal. Look at their hands." The creatures were indeed gesturing, their elongated fingers moving in complex patterns that seemed to correspond with their vocalizations. It was clearly a sophisticated communication system, one that had evolved over millennia in the crushing depths. More creatures gathered, their pale forms creating a nightmarish assembly around the tiny human vessel. Their movements became increasingly agitated, and the bioluminescence in their structures began to pulse more rapidly, bathing the seafloor in an angry red glow. "I think we've overstayed our welcome," Caspian said, his pilot's instincts screaming danger. "Whatever we just did, they don't like it." But as he reached for the ascent controls, the creatures moved with terrifying speed. Dozens of webbed hands slammed against the hull, creating a cacophony of metallic strikes that echoed through the cabin. The submersible rocked violently under their assault. "They're trying to breach the hull," Lysander screamed, pointing to stress fractures appearing around the viewing ports. The creature's strikes were methodical, focusing on weak points in the vessel's construction. These beings understood engineering, understood how to destroy what humans had built. One of them produced what looked like a tool, a piece of shaped coral or bone that it used to pry at the hull seams with disturbing precision. "They have technology," Octavia gasped, watching more creatures emerge from the structures, carrying similar implements. Primitive, but effective. "Emergency ascent," Caspian shouted, firing the ballast tanks and engaging the emergency thrusters. The Haitian explorer shot upward, but the creatures followed. Through the rear cameras, the team watched in horror as the pale forms streaked through the water behind them, their movements impossibly fast for the crushing depths. They moved like dolphins, but with purpose and intelligence that no marine animal possessed. "They're keeping pace," Octavia said, her voice barely a whisper. "How are they keeping pace?" "Specialized physiology," Thessaly replied, her scientific mind still functioning despite her terror. "They've evolved for rapid vertical movement. Look at their body structure. They're built for this." The ascent that should have been a relief became a nightmare chase. The creatures followed them up through the crushing depths, their forms becoming more visible as bioluminescent organs began to glow with increased intensity. They were beautiful and terrible, adapted for a world without sunlight, without mercy. At 30,000 feet, Thessaly noticed something that chilled her to the bone. "They're changing," she whispered. The creatures' bodies were indeed adapting as they rose. Specialized bladders were inflating, allowing them to maintain neutral buoyancy as the pressure decreased. Their limbs were lengthening further, optimizing for swimming in less dense water. They had evolved not just for the depths, but for transition between the depths and the surface. "This is impossible," Lysander muttered, watching the transformation through the cameras. "No organism can adapt that quickly to pressure changes, unless they've done it before," Octavia said quietly. "Unless they've been to the surface before." At 25,000 feet, more creatures joined the pursuit. They emerged from side trenches and underwater canyons, answering some call that the humans couldn't hear. The sonar screen filled with contacts, dozens, then hundreds of the pale forms, converging on their location. Caspian's voice was grim. "We've got company. Lots of it." The creatures weren't just following them. They were organizing. The newcomers formed ranks around the original pursuers, creating a formation that looked disturbingly military in nature. They were treating the human intrusion as an invasion, and they were mounting a coordinated response. At 20,000 feet, the hull began to vibrate with that same bone-deep frequency they had heard in the depths, but now it was amplified by hundreds of voices. The sound was so intense that the crew had to cover their ears, and several instruments began to malfunction. "They're calling to something," Thessaly realized with growing horror. "They're not just following us, they're summoning others." The sonar screen erupted with new contacts, thousands of them, rising from trenches across the ocean floor. The deep sea dwellers were awakening across the entire Atlantic basin, and they were answering the call. "Jesus Christ," Caspian breathed, staring at the sonar display. "There are thousands of them. How many of these things are down there?" "Millions," Octavia whispered, her archaeological mind racing. "If they built those cities we saw, if they've been living down there for millennia, there could be millions of them." At 15,000 feet, the first hull breach occurred. A hairline fracture in the rear section began to spray pressurized water into the cabin. The team scrambled to seal it, but they all knew the truth. The creatures had damaged something vital during their assault. "Emergency patch holding," Caspian reported, but his voice lacked confidence. For now, Thessaly was studying the creatures through the cameras, her scientific training overriding her fear. "Look at the behavior patterns. They're not random. They're following specific individuals. Leaders. This is a hierarchical society. Indeed, certain creatures seem to be directing the others, their bioluminescent patterns different from the rest. The followers responded to these leaders, signals with military precision, adjusting their formation and tactics based on gestured commands. At 12,000 feet, the creatures began to exhibit new behaviors. Some of them produced objects that the team initially mistook for natural formations, but closer observation revealed them to be crafted items, weapons, tools, devices whose purpose was unclear, but whose artificial nature was undeniable. "They're planning something," Lysander said, watching as the creatures arranged themselves in specific patterns around the ascending submersible. "This isn't just pursuit anymore. They're preparing for something." At 10,000 feet, that preparation became clear. The creatures attacked in coordinated waves, using their tools to target specific areas of the hull. They had observed the vessel's weak points during the initial assault, and were now exploiting that knowledge systematically. "They're learning," Caspian said through gritted teeth, fighting to maintain control as the submersible shuddered under the assault. "They're adapting their tactics." The hull groaned under the methodical attack. These weren't mindless predators. They were intelligent warriors who understood both their own capabilities and their enemies' weaknesses. At 8,000 feet, the radio crackled to life as they approached communication range with the surface. "Haitian Explorer, this is Coast Guard Station Miami. We're reading emergency ascent. What's your status?" Caspian grabbed the radio with shaking hands. "This is Haitian Explorer. We have a situation. Unknown life forms are pursuing us to the surface. Repeat, unknown hostile life forms are ascending from the deep ocean." Static filled the channel before the response came. "Haitian Explorer, please clarify your last transmission." "Ancient intelligent species from the deep trenches," Octavia screamed into the radio. "They're organized, they have weapons, and they're following us up. You need to evacuate the coastal areas." "Haitian Explorer, you're breaking up. Please repeat." At 6,000 feet, the creature's appearance continued to change dramatically. Their bodies were becoming more streamlined, their limbs more powerful. Most disturbing of all, their eyes were adapting. The massive black orbs designed for the eternal darkness of the deep were developing protective membranes, preparing for exposure to surface light. "They're not just following us to eliminate the threat," Thessaly realized with mounting horror. "They're planning to stay. They're invasion adapted." The implication struck the team. These creatures weren't just defending their territory. They were preparing to claim new territory, the surface world. At 4,000 feet, the submersible's hull finally began to give way completely. Multiple fractures spread across the titanium surface like a spider web, and water began pouring in from several locations simultaneously. "We're losing hull integrity," Caspian shouted over the sound of rushing water and groaning metal. "Emergency surface, all power to thrusters." The creatures seemed to sense their prey's desperation and pressed their attack with renewed fury. Their tools, now clearly weapons, struck the hull with calculated precision, widening existing cracks and creating new breach points. At 2,000 feet, the first creature broke through. A webbed hand, larger than any human hand, punched through a weakened section of hull near Lysander's position. Water rushed in around the appendage as the creature forced its way through the opening, its elongated form squeezing through spaces that should have been too small. Lysander screamed as the creature's head emerged, its massive black eyes fixing on him with predatory intelligence. The mouth opened, revealing those needle-sharp teeth. The creature's hand shot out with lightning speed, grasping Lysander by the throat. Its grip was impossibly strong, adapted for the crushing pressures of the deep, and Lysander's windpipe collapsed under the force. Thessaly grabbed an emergency axe from the wall and struck at the creature's arm, but the weapon bounced off skin that had evolved to withstand pressures that would crush diamonds. The creature barely noticed the blow. With a sound like breaking timber, the creature snapped Lysander's neck and released the body. It then began to systematically examine the submersible's interior, its intelligent eyes cataloging every piece of human technology, every aspect of human physiology. At 1,000 feet, more creatures broke through the felling hull. They didn't attack the remaining humans immediately. Instead, they studied them, their ancient intelligence analyzing these surface dwellers who had dared to intrude upon their domain. One of the creatures examined the submersible's controls, its webbed fingers tracing the instruments with disturbing understanding. The creatures were memorizing everything: human anatomy, human technology, human weaknesses. They were preparing for war with an intelligence that had evolved over millions of years in the planet's most hostile environment. At 500 feet, the submersible's hull finally gave way completely. The Haitian explorer imploded in a burst of twisted metal and rushing water, but not before the creatures had completed their examination of the humans within. Dr. Thessaly Campos' last sight was of those ancient black eyes studying her with cold intelligence, memorizing every detail of human anatomy, human technology, human weakness. One of the creatures leaned close to her face as the water rushed in, and with her dying breath, she heard it speak in perfect, unaccented English.
"We know where you live now."
The Coast Guard rescue vessels found only debris and a few scattered body parts that marine biologists would later describe as inconsistent with known predation patterns. The official report listed the incident as catastrophic hull failure during an unauthorized deep-sea expedition, but in the weeks that followed, the ocean began to change. Shipping lanes reported strange incidents with increasing frequency. Deep-sea fishing vessels found their nets filled not with fish, but with technological debris that matched no known human construction. Fragments of what appeared to be sophisticated tools made from organic materials. Oil rigs reported mysterious damage to their deep-water equipment, damage that showed signs of intelligent sabotage rather than random destruction. Submarines on routine patrols encountered sonar contacts that moved too fast and too intelligently to be any known marine life. These contacts seemed to be studying human vessels, learning their capabilities and weaknesses. Marine biologists worldwide began reporting unprecedented changes in deep-sea ecosystems. Established migration patterns were disrupting as entire species fled the deepest parts of the ocean. Something was claiming the abyss, and everything else was being driven upward. Most disturbing of all were the reports from survivors of maritime incidents, accounts of pale figures emerging from the waves, speaking in the voices of loved ones, trying to lure people into the water. Those who investigated these reports often found the supposed witnesses had disappeared, leaving behind only wet footprints that led to the water's edge. The abyss had awakened, and it was no longer content to remain hidden in the depths. An ancient intelligence that had ruled the deep ocean for millions of years had been roused to action, and it viewed humanity not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a species to be conquered and claimed. The invasion had begun, and the surface dwellers were about to learn that they were not alone on their planet, and they were not the dominant species they believed themselves to be. And so, dear listeners, we emerge from another dark corner of Carmen's crypt. But remember, the horrors you've heard tonight are merely echoes of the terrors that await in the shadows of your own mind. If you enjoyed your stay in the crypt, why not invite a friend to join us next week? After all, fear is best when shared. Leave a review if you dare, or share your own tales of terror on my social media. Who knows, your nightmares might just become my next story. Until next time, keep checking under your bed. And remember, in Carmen's crypt, every fear comes alive, and no one is truly safe. Sweet dreams, if you can still sleep at all.